Thank you. Today I want to give you a presentation about the future. But before we get to that, I want to take a moment to, hopefully for the last time, reflect on the past. Because I think the past tells us a story that illustrates where we are in the present. And right now, I think we're actually in a really good place. The events of the last month have been costly, but we've gained something extraordinary out of it. We've gained an efficiency dividend that I think is going to repay that cost, and more than just repay it. I think it's going to be something that we're going to benefit from far into the future. So let's take a little walk down memory lane and consider how we got here. On August 1st of 2017, Bitcoin Cash split from Bitcoin BTC. And it took with it a large community of people who were all united by one idea, one simple idea, which was that we wanted blocks that were bigger than 1 megabyte. And that's it. But it really wasn't quite enough. It took with it a whole lot of people that had a lot of different ideas about where the future of Bitcoin rested. Ideas, some of which were about building on top of the protocol, but many of those ideas were about ways to change and improve the protocol. There was no clear roadmap for the future of Bitcoin Cash. There was no real agreement even on the scaling schedule. There was no real agreement on what the future of the protocol should look like. And thus we began 15 months of conflict, infighting between groups, and a hell of a lot of energy was wasted. I mean, this is anecdotal, but I would probably estimate that maybe 80% of my time was taken up in dealing with these conflicts, trying to find resolutions, trying to deal with the politics, etc. And that's not a good way to build an ecosystem. So where are we now? We have Bitcoin SV. It's an ecosystem that has been very rapidly populated with businesses that share a vision, serious businesses that actually have real business plans, and businesses that have bought into the idea that Bitcoin SV has a really clear roadmap. It has a really clear roadmap with regards to the protocol, which is to keep it stable and to just build on top of it. And what does that mean for us? It means something that the other group probably can't truthfully say. We've got nothing left to fight about. That means that all of that wasted energy is going to go into building now. And I'm really excited about the future that that creates. We can still disagree, and we certainly will. But when we do disagree, it's not going to manifest itself in hash wars and everything basically coming to a halt. People will build what they disagree about, and they'll compete fairly. And that's the kind of Bitcoin that I want to see in the future. I genuinely believe that we have a very good chance of Bitcoin SV never splitting again, because we've taken away that point of contention, and now it's time for us to build. So I am really excited about the future, a future that is about scaling, a future that is about building an ecosystem, a future that is about bringing global payments to everyone in the world to enhance people's economic freedom. This is what Bitcoin's all about, and it's coming. So let's talk about the future. This is the part where I get to geek out. Instant transactions. We've heard a lot about instant transactions today. And I'm going to talk about a couple of the ways that we can help make those even more secure than they already are. And I'll also talk a bit about why they're actually so important. Before I get to that, though, can anyone hear Reddit lighting up? Minor pseudo-identity. This is a tool that is an optional tool that could enable that can improve the zero confirmation experience. And I just did it. I'm trying really, really hard to stop saying zeroconf and start saying instant transactions, because zeroconf is a phrase that means something probably to most of us, but we are trying to aim for a market out there that doesn't necessarily have a strong background in Bitcoin, and instant transactions is something that means something to everyone. So, what is miner pseudo-identity? It's a completely optional tool that requires no consensus changes. In a nutshell, it's basically a JSON document placed in the Coinbase transaction via an op return. It includes a pseudonymous identity that is much like a Bitcoin address. That is, it's a public key and a signature. The signature basically shows proof that the person that published the document has the corresponding private key. And it enables a miner to publish information backed by their mining history. Now think about what that means. This isn't just some random piece of information that's appeared on the internet that has someone making the claim that, that it's authentic. This is actually backed by proof of work. And they can publish information using the backing of that proof of work both on and off chain. It's communication backed by proof of work without necessarily needing to reveal your actual identity, very much like a Bitcoin address. And it can be implemented by pools on a per miner or per pool basis. That's a detail I'll cover briefly later. So, there's about four threads on RPTC right now with the words permission mining in the title. So I'm going to explain why miner pseudo ID really kind of isn't that. Firstly, it's always existed because pseudonymous identities have always been attributable to miners. And there's three different ways that they can be done: Coinbase string, Coinbase payout address, and monitoring IPs to see where blocks are coming from first. But each of these mechanisms is less than ideal because they weren't really designed with this use case in mind, and it's a conflation of concerns, which any architect will tell you is a disaster waiting to happen. So here's some of the problems. Coinbase string is forgeable. Anyone they want that can mine a block can stick CoinGeek.com in the Coinbase string. It's also a limited size, so you can't put much data into it. Coinbase payout address, it assumes miners will only pay to themselves, which is not always the case. Our good friend Luke Jr. was the first to do this back in 2011. He started paying the miners in his pools who were members of his pool directly using the Coinbase payout, using the Coinbase transaction. And it was these massive transactions that had hundreds and hundreds of outputs of tiny little amounts. Most of them are probably dust and unspendable on BTC now. So, also, if you want to use this identity and you're paying out yourself to multiple addresses, then proof of identity becomes very cumbersome. Monitoring for the originating IP of blocks. It is a way to do it, but it's a really complex way to do it because you've got to build complicated monitoring tools and connect to almost everyone on the network until you've found all of the miners. And if you happen to switch it off, then until you switch it back on again, all of that data is lost. So why would a miner use this? Well, this feeds into instant transactions because it is one of the use cases. But an identity that is expensive to create requires the mining of blocks. Because it requires the mining of blocks, it carries the weight of reputation. This is an exploitable and a valuable asset. And I'm going to talk about Escrow as a business model because it explains this perfectly. An escrow is a business that essentially asks you to trust it, and it treats that trust as its key asset. It's essentially saying to you, if you trust me and I violate your trust, I'm putting my business on the line here. Single violation of that trust, no one will ever use that business again. And a miner ID can be used in much the same way. But it does something that the existing ID mechanisms that we talked about before can't do, which is it provides a facility to revoke your identity in the case you've lost your private keys, which means that someone else can't get a hold of your private keys and then go around doing bad things that are going to be attributable to you. So there's a few use cases for a pseudonymous identity. Communication, I talked about before. Imagine a developer portal where miners could come along and post signed messages using these keys. And there's a tool in the background that's been scanning the blockchain, grabbing all of these keys and tallying up how many blocks each individual miner has mined. So miners would be able to talk to developers without having to reveal their identities if they don't want to. And we know there are quite a few out there that don't. Just look at the other wedge on the pie chart. Harnessing reputation, and this is what I was talking about before. A miner can respond to a query about the status of a transaction using their signature, with a signature, and effectively staking their reputation on the truthfulness of that response. I'll go into that in a bit more detail. Private miner network backbone. This is one of the more exciting ones from my point of view, but and probably one of the first that will be implemented. So you can use the public keys of known miners to establish private authenticated connections to other miners. So this is essentially a way to automate the creation of the small world network. And it exists today to various degrees. But as miners come and go, someone has to sit there manually trying to find out who these other people are, get in contact with them. Maybe they don't want to be contacted, and privately get an IP address that they can establish a connection with. With a miner ID, this can all be done automatically, and it doesn't compromise anybody's desire for anonymity or pseudonymity. Services advertising. There are more ways that miners can provide services for the Bitcoin network than that lead to revenue streams than just the traditional ones, which is mining, which produces block rewards and transaction fees. Again, we'll talk about that in a bit more detail. So, how can I use it? When I say I'm talking about miners. I'll just skip over this quite briefly because we've essentially created a tool for the document creation, the creation of the JSON document. Very, very minimal changes to the pool software are required because it's actually a separate component with an RPC interface, or REST interface, I think. So from the mining software, from the pool software point of view, literally all they have to do is at the point in the job generation process where they get a Coinbase transaction, they flick it off to this API and the Coinbase transaction comes back modified with the extra data. So we've deliberately designed this in a way to make it simple for any miner, any pool to use. So it leads us on to one in the swear jar. Secure instant transactions. Why is it important? Our target market is not the people who believe in Bitcoin, it's everyone else in the world. And everyone else in the world is used to a payment experience that only takes a few seconds. So we need to beat that. We need to show that Bitcoin is easier, cheaper, and safer than existing point-of-sale methods. And then it becomes an overwhelming value proposition. All right, so the real problem with Zeroconf is that Bitcoiners love their coffee. I'm an Aussie, so I'm going to use beer. We're told that transactions aren't safe until confirmed in a block, on average 10 minutes. Coffee gets cold in 10 minutes, and in Australia, beer gets really warm in 10 minutes. So we're competing with payment methods that take seconds, and shortening the block time has really zero useful effect. Unless you get it down to 3 to 5 seconds, it's one of those situations where the effect is 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Oh, now we have an effect. Okay. But Bitcoin doesn't work very well with 5-second blocks. And in fact, even if you did have 5-second blocks, they'd be highly insecure because there'd be orphans all over the place. OneConf isn't safe either, not even with 10-minute blocks. And we have to remember that security is probabilistic. as is risk, as is financial risk from a merchant's point of view. So I want to define two types of double spend here because they have different characteristics. The broadcast double spend and the collusion double spend. And the broadcast double spend is a much easier problem to solve than the collusion double spend. But what I'm going to try and demonstrate to you is that the collusion double spend really doesn't make any sense from the point of view of the people that might perpetrate it. So broadcast double spend is where a customer broadcasts a double spend transaction at almost the same time as giving the legitimate transaction to the merchant. It relies on having better peer-to-peer connectivity than the merchant. Due to the first seen rule, Bitcoin nodes will drop any transaction that double spends one that they've already seen. And that's probably unlikely because you're more than likely actually going to be in a shop using a mobile phone whilst competing with a merchant who's got a back-end payment processor who has a very, very well provisioned network connectivity. They're highly visible if double spends are relayed. Now, it's not the case right now that not many Bitcoin node implementations actually do relay double spends. They just drop them and forget about them. But even if it's not relayed, it can still be highly visible to a merchant that goes out and looks. Now, collusion double spend is where a customer secretly sends a double spend transaction to a miner that agrees to mine it. Some sneaky miner has decided that, you know, I can probably make better fees, higher fees if I engage in this double spending practice. If the colluding miner agrees to keep it secret, it remains undetectable until mined into the block, giving the consumer time to escape with their coffee. The chance of success is only proportional to the miner's hash power. So if you've got someone mining, willing to do collusion double spending and they've got 10% of the hash power, you're only going to be successful 1 in 10 times. The last point is quite important. Miners are quite easily identifiable as the source of these double spends. Whether they use a miner ID or not is irrelevant. And the miners do risk being punished or orphaned by other miners who see this behavior as harmful to the network. And I'll explain a little bit more why I think that this sort of behavior, this sort of sanctioning behavior is probably likely to happen in the future. So when thinking about double spending, it's important to understand the scope of the problem because it is actually quite limited. There's a whole lot of commerce scenarios where it really doesn't matter whether you have to wait for a transaction to be confirmed or not. Think about Amazon. How often do you think they get your order, pack it, and ship it within 10 minutes? So it's really only when a merchant provides an irrevocable delivery of goods or services immediately after receiving a valid signed transaction. And in e-commerce, there's really not that many scenarios where this could happen. One of the few that I could think of was non-DRM protected, and there's not much of that left now. Non-digital streaming content that you can download before the merchant sees any sign of a double spend. So it largely leaves us with bricks and mortar stores, where you take the goods to the counter, you pay, then you leave. And the majority of these transactions are going to be small. I mean, I admit I completely guessed this number, but it seems to make sense. Maybe, you know, most of them are probably going to be well under $1,000. I don't spend more than $1,000 in a retail store too often. So when we're examining the instant transaction problem and trying to understand what it is we need to do about it, it's useful to compare it to what we're trying to beat. So we're going to think about credit cards, PayPal, FPOS, that sort of thing. Transaction costs for these kinds of transactions are, well, they vary from country to country. In Australia, in the UK, it's about 20p plus a small percentage. I think in the US, it's about 30 cents, possibly also including a small percentage. And it's important to remember that cash is not free either for the merchant. They've got to pay somebody to count it, to store it. There's the risk of it being pinched on the way to the bank. and it adds accounting costs as well. I don't have the exact number with me, but one of our business analysts did a study on this a while back, and if I recall correctly, I think he told me that it's actually quite similar to the electronic payment methods. So, with the electronic payment methods that we're talking about, a little bit of quick Googling will show you that the chargeback rates for credit card payments vary in the order of 0.5 to 1.5%. It depends a lot on which industry you're talking about, which industry sector. But let's just say, let's take an average of 1% as a target. There are potentially additional costs as well. And the key difference is that chargebacks usually happen long after someone's left the store. Whereas in a double spend scenario, it's going to get found out usually within a few minutes. So, here's a few numbers. Just to illustrate, I guess, the unlikeliness of the scenario. Now, it does still exist. Comparing risks with credit card payments. So let's make an assumption that we're looking for a target of less than a 1% fraud loss. Let's assume that there's a 10% miner out there that's willing to engage in collusion double spends. Assume that it takes about 30 seconds to make a clean getaway with your coffee. And here's the thing, in order to make these numbers work, you need to assume that 10% of the population will routinely engage in double spends. Now that's a risky behavior, and that's a lot of people. It's not quite as simple as that, but we'll get to that in a moment. Now, not all blocks are mined in 10 minutes. It's an average of 10 minutes. And if you do the maths, it's roughly about 5% of them are mined within the 30 seconds. So that's the window that we decided was the clean getaway. So roughly for every 20 double spends in this scenario, only 2 will be successful. You get a 10% discount on your cup of coffee. You can probably get that by joining the rewards program of the coffee shop. But for every 2 successful attempts, you only get 1. You're going to get caught once. So, as I said, I'm simplifying this a little bit. It is a naive approach because you could always delay the double spend by sending it to the miner later, or the miner might hold it back on your behalf until you give them the signal that you've gotten away. But that also diminishes the chances of a transaction getting confirmed. But there are other deterrents. Collusion mining is really bad business. Reputation of Bitcoin as a useful asset is a valuable thing that I think miners actually recognize. We've seen it in the past. The way that miners are very cautious. A whole lot of the block size debate and the reason why it dragged out so long was because miners were reluctant to do anything that they thought might affect the price. Now, if Bitcoin is a payment system that is in global use and is underpinned by the simple fact that it provides a better payment experience than any other payment system, how does it make sense for any miner to decide that it's in the best interests of Bitcoin to allow double spending to happen? So unless a majority of miners agree to engage in this quite destructive practice, willingly harming the reputation of Bitcoin, the threat of sanction is sufficient to create a disincentive to do it. In March, Craig spoke about a plan to start orphaning blocks that have double spends in them. And there's a couple of technical obstacles in order to get to a place where you can start doing that, but I do firmly believe that this is going to happen in the near future. One of the dependencies is that it requires more than 51% of the miners to engage in this practice. In fact, you can get away with it with a bit less than 50% because it still creates a disincentive for the people that are including double spends. But it does end up costing the miner that's trying to enforce this policy significantly more. And the last deterrent is that if you're walking around routinely in bricks and mortar stores, attempting to double spend, attempting to defraud them, you're coming face to face with people who own the shops. There's only so many times you're going to be able to go into a shop and pull this off before they start to recognize you. So, I've probably spent a few minutes here trying to point out that maybe this isn't actually a problem. It's not a non-problem, it's a small problem, but it's a problem that we can make smaller. And there's a few different ways that we can solve it. Firstly, we've got to remember that the solution doesn't have to be perfect. We don't need to build a system in which it is impossible to double spend. We only need to build a system in which the risk is measurable and it's small enough that it provides a better value proposition to the merchant than the alternatives. So here's 3 quick methods, and I'll go through them all one by one. A temporary trust and an escrow, offload the risk, or measure the risk. Threshold signature wallets with one key held by an escrow. So these work in a similar way to multi-sig, and in fact you could do this with multi-sig just as easily. You have the split of private keys set up in such a way as the escrow must be involved in a transaction unless you decide to go through a longer process to recover your funds, which means you're not dependent on the escrow. The escrow stakes their reputation on the fact that they will never co-sign a double spend, and they'll know what's a double spend because they know what they've signed before. So the merchant has to trust this reputation, but this is what we're supposed to be getting away from in Bitcoin, isn't it? We don't want to be dependent on trusting people. Well, it's a different kind of trust because it's a very temporary trust. You have to trust them until a block is confirmed. But remember, you're also trusting somebody whose business is in ruins if they violate that trust just once. Another option, offload the risk. When I first wrote this presentation, I forgot that our good friend Daniel with Gap 600 actually already has a service like this. Essentially, it's Zeroconf Insurance, and I would imagine most merchants are probably not going to organize this themselves or to be part of a payment processor offering, where they have in the back end an arrangement with some kind of underwriter, and they just build it into the fee that the merchant is paying. Based on the numbers that I've looked at, I think it's still going to, once you build this into the cost per transaction, it's still going to be vastly cheaper than what merchants are paying right now. And it does require actuarial tools for the underwriter to understand risk. Any insurance underwriter has various mechanisms for working out what the real risk is of the outcome that they're insuring against. I'm going to talk about one that can improve that measurement, and I'm sure there are plenty of others. Daniel might be able to enlighten us on some more. So, if we're going to measure the risk, we need to put in place a few assumptions, and we're just trying to explain one model of how Zeroconf Assurance can work. First one, probabilistic assurance is good enough. All security is probabilistic. It's not a binary option. It's either secure or not secure. It's 99.9% secure, or add a few more nines to that. Even your private keys are not 100% secure. It might take a few billion years for someone to get lucky, but instant transactions are a premium service. A minimum fee is required to gain high confidence in Zeroconf. This is already the case. I mean, if you put out a free transaction with no fee, you don't actually even have any assurance that it will ever get mined. So I think the fact that it is a premium service is something that merchants will be more than willing to accept because it's a very small premium, but it also enables them to offer something better to their own customer. That is, the fees that get built into the price of the goods that the customer are buying can be lower because the merchant's fees are lower. Minimum fee will not be fixed. So Bitcoin fees, transaction fees, they should float. And in fact, the software allows for this already. Not many miners do anything other than charge 1 Satoshi per byte, but it's entirely possible. And I would expect in the future, as the Bitcoin economy grows and mining becomes more competitive, that we'll see miners starting to tweak fees. The assumption is that the majority of miners respect the first seen rule. And the reason why I think that they will do that goes back to what I said before. I think miners understand that the value of Bitcoin, the value proposition of Bitcoin is that it is a payment system. And undermining the payment system by not respecting the first seen rule not only might bring the wrath of other miners down on their heads, but it's undermining the value of the very asset that they're being paid in. All right, this assumption is really quite important. Knowledge of a double spend attempt is just as good from the merchant's point of view as prevention. If someone hands me a blank banknote, a piece of white paper, and tries to pay me with it in a shop, of course, they're not going to get their goods. Attempting a double spend that the merchant finds out about is perfectly analogous to this. Miners keep transactions below their own fee threshold, but above a minimum baseline in a secondary mempool so that they can reject double spends. Let me explain. At the moment, the first seen rule is actually first seen, then drop. So if a miner sees a, that's a different thing. At the moment when a miner receives a transaction that they don't intend to mine, they drop it and forget about it. It might be because it's got too low a fee. It might be because it's non-standard. It could be for any number of reasons. And that opens up an attack vector, which I'm going to talk about shortly, which is called the fast double replay. And this solution depends on the fact that at least one miner is mining transactions with fees at this low minimum baseline. Again, I'll cover that when we get back to the fast double respend attack. So here's a few things that we can do about this, and this is something that's in development right now. A new merchant services API to be provided by miners. Currently, the Bitcoin node has an RPC interface, and that's not appropriate for this purpose because the RPC interface is intended for use by a trusted user. It doesn't have any kind of encryption, and it does require a plain text or a nearly plain text username and password. So there's no way you're going to give that out to any random on the internet. So this will be a new API, maybe a REST API. And it's just got three simple methods. One, get fee quote. You can poll a bunch of miners and say, what's your fee policy? Two, submit a transaction. This is an alternative to just broadcasting it on the peer-to-peer network. It allows you to send it directly to miners. And just jumping back to miner ID for a moment, if miners start using services advertising, then they can publish endpoints in their Coinbase transactions so that merchants know exactly where to find them in order to reach this API. And the last one is the important one, which is the query transaction status method. It simply allows a merchant to poll a miner and say, what are you doing with this transaction? Are you planning on mining it or not? And this is where the miner's reputation comes in, and it's important because the miner can, optionally, and they may charge a fee for this service, use a signature, include a signature, using their public key, which is backed by the weight of all of their proof of work to certify that this is true. Yes, I have said I'm accepting this transaction and I promise I'm going to mine it, or no, I'm not. Now, the more proof of work that the miner has behind them, the more valuable this statement is. Because if I can query 3 miners and hit 90% of the network, then I would logically divide the amount that I'm going to pay all of those miners up based upon their total hash power. Because my aim here is to get a level of assurance which is some number out of 100%. So the merchant gets a fee quote from many miners. They know now which fee points will be accepted by a certain percentage of miners, and probably they'd be aiming for 99.99% or even 100. And then they make a risk-based choice on what fee to charge. There might be an outlier miner who charges 1,000 times more than everybody else. So they might choose to drop that one because they only represent 0.1% of the miners. The merchant now creates a payment request with an appropriate fee and sends it to the customer. Now this is going to require some extensions to the BIP70 payment protocol, and I'll be talking with all of the wallet providers about this in the very near future. The merchant can actually assume the cost of the transaction fee on behalf of the customer. One way they can do it is they can create a transaction paying the customer the transaction fee, give the customer the transaction ID, and or basically give the customer the output details, and without the customer actually having to see the whole transaction, they can now create a payment transaction to the merchant using the merchant's fee transaction also as an input, so that they pay just the amount that the merchant's charging for the goods and the merchant pays the fee on their behalf. So the merchant verifies that the appropriate fee is added, then they submit it directly to the miners. They might wait 2 seconds, they don't necessarily have to, and randomly query a bunch of miners to get the status of this transaction. Is it going to be mined? And the miners optionally sign the response if they potentially want to earn a bit of extra money, or if they just want to, contribute to the Zeroconf security of the network out of the goodness of their hearts. So a merchant now has all that he needs to measure the risk. And the merchant doesn't have to do this with every single transaction, and they don't have to poll every single miner, and they don't have to get fee quotes every time there's a new transaction. They can, miner fees, they change slowly. At the moment they change, maybe once every few years. But polling the miners once a minute or once an hour to get an understanding of what their fee policies are is probably more than good enough. And if you're taking a risk-based approach, then yeah, maybe you don't actually want to poll for every transaction. Maybe you don't want to look at, you don't want to poll 100% of miners for every transaction. These are decisions that will be made by the merchants and the payment processors using a risk-based model. So the last thing I want to talk about is the fast double respend attack, the so-called attack. It is an attack, but it really is quite easy to mitigate. The problem is you send a transaction that you know some miners are going to reject. So let's say there's a miner out there who charges 1 cent, a miner who charges 2 cents, and one that charges 3 cents. I send out a transaction with 1 cent worth of fees. One miner accepts it. The other two look at it and go, hey, not enough money. They drop it. They forget about it. Now I send out a transaction that has a 3 cent fee. The guy who took it originally, who charges 1 cent, gets it and says, oh, I've already got this transaction. Oh, sorry, this is a double spend for a transaction I've already accepted. The miners that charge 2 and 3 cents say, oh, first time I've seen anyone trying to spend those outputs because I forgot about the other one. So, mitigations. Miners don't forget transactions that they're planning on, that they aren't planning to mine. Now, you can't do this for every transaction. You can't do this with zero fee transactions because it just makes it easy for someone to fill up your memory. But you can set a minimum threshold. And remembering that Zeroconf is a premium service, nobody should ever expect to be able to get Zeroconf security on a transaction without paying a fee. And this minimum fee is not too hard for miners to determine. They just need to poll a few other miners, possibly using these service endpoints, possibly just by observing what transactions are getting mined into the blockchain, to work out roughly where that baseline level is. And this goes to the assumption that transactions with fees below that minimum baseline simply can't be assumed to be Zeroconf safe. And that's fine. It's not going to stop any kind of commerce happening because the fees we're talking about here are tiny. So this secondary mempool, basically it's just a store where if you get a transaction and the fee's too low, instead of forgetting about it, you pop it into this separate bucket. And then whenever new transactions come in and you do your usual double spend checks, you just check it against this other bucket again. And that enables you to go, okay, I'm now able to respect the first seen rule across the board because I haven't forgotten about anything. And this does rely on one assumption. There has to be at least one miner that is mining these transactions that end up in the secondary mempool. Otherwise, it'll just get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until you start running out of memory. Fortunately, I know there's at least one miner who's more than willing to do this. So this isn't going to be a problem going into the future. So that last point was just about miners querying each other to learn the minimum threshold to put transactions into the secondary mempool. So, last slide. What we need to do to make this a reality? Well, a few things, and a lot of them are in progress, and some of them are actually already done. The Merchant Services API, that's work in progress. Parallel transaction validation. That enables making non-standard transactions safe across the board, which means goodbye non-standard transactions. You'll be able to use any transactions that you like. And the reason for this is because with long scripts, there are probably some kinds of attacks that enable people to create transactions that have a hugely long computation time. And if there are any of those and somebody exploits this attack, there's a really simple way to get around it in a global way without having to identify the attacks and fix them one by one. That is, you have multiple parallel pipelines that you can feed transactions through for verification, and you just assign a few of them as being prioritized for well-known transaction templates. And then there's a few that are for any type of transaction. That means that these weird attack transactions will end up in these couple of pipes over here, while the rest of the highways remain clear. And over time, as we get to understand more and more transaction types, and this should be a miner configurable option, the miners can add more and more templates to the priority queue once they're convinced that they're safe. The secondary mempool I mentioned before, that's a piece of work that will have to happen inside the Bitcoin node software, so the Bitcoin SV team will be first to implement that. Updated BIP70 payment protocol in order to add a few extra functions to it, one of which would be the mechanism for the merchant to actually provide for paying the fee themselves. Wallet support. Sorry, Handcash and Centby, I probably should have asked you before I put this in the presentation that you're going to lead the way. I think once it's all kind of explained, you'll probably agree that this is going to improve the user experience for your users. So I think it's a fairly compelling case. And as I said, all of the above are in progress. I think we can have a complete implementation of this system for probabilistic Zeroconf security done by Q3. And we'll definitely be making some of the first steps available in Q1. One of the first things that we'll see is probably the miner ID. Not geared towards this, but geared towards the fast network backbone for the miners. So, final words. A miner's proof of work is an exploitable asset. This is something, I gave a similar presentation to miners just recently, and this is something that I think a lot of them hadn't thought about before. And the next point is one that really did get a few of them excited, that there's more revenue streams available to them than just block rewards and transaction fees. SPV services may well become a paid service at some point in the future. And don't be frightened off by that. When I say a paid service, I'm talking about something that might happen almost automatically in the background of your wallet. You establish a 5-cent payment channel to an SPV service provider when you start your wallet up with maybe a 6-month lifetime. This is a unidirectional channel, the really simple type. And this sort of service might cost something, might cost 1/1000th of a cent per request. But multiply that by a few billion or hundreds of billions, then it does become worthwhile for someone to provide the service. And the last point is that instant transactions can be safe without consensus changes. Miners really are incentivized to make sure that they are, because it underpins the value of the payment processing system that props up their business. So, that's it.
Thank you, Steve.